Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me the floor and an opportunity to speak, not sign. As you probably have not heard of, today, well, actually, the entire month is Deaf Awareness Month, and it culminates in Deaf Awareness Week at the end of September, which is why I decided to talk about deaf people and sign languages, because we interpreters, we speak a lot, but we forget very often that American Sign Language is one of the most commonly interpreted languages, at least in the country where I am, the US. So, first of all, why do we do that? Well, just look at the word language. Etymologically speaking, it comes from lang, which comes from Latin for tongue. So that's why when we talk about languages, every hearing person will automatically think of something that they can produce with their mouth. It's not necessarily the case. Sign languages are actual languages. The definition is a means of communication by which you can say anything you want. Um, Now, there's a lot of history to that. If we go way back into the past, like before writing systems, before like codified languages, back to, I don't know, maybe Neanderthal, deaf people were members of society, normal members of society. When people used to communicate by grunting and miming, well, deaf people would grunt just as much as the others, and everyone would mime. So that worked out well. Unfortunately, we don't really have many recordings of what happened back then, so it's just speculation. The first point in history that was a real turning point for deaf people is something that happened during the ancient Greek times with a philosopher you may have heard of. His name is Plato, and he believed that what separates men from animals is the ability to speak. So deaf people who usually did not speak because when you don't hear, you don't know what to reproduce, were considered dumb, which was a reason to let them know to consider them not humans, basically. And this created a world of terrible, terrible things. For example, there were instances where they would just like throw deaf babies into volcanoes to get rid of them. There were minorities that was heavily discriminated against, and people often thought that deaf people could not be intelligent because they couldn't speak. So I feel that this is the right moment to let you know that we talk about deaf people or hearing impaired, not hard of hearing, and also never, ever, ever say deaf mute or deaf dumb because they can communicate. They just choose not to use sounds that they can't hear, even though there are some deaf people who do actually who are really good at oralizing. Um, Now, a little bit of history for sign languages in general. After Plato, obviously, no one would want to speak a sign language, except maybe in the monasteries where the monks had made a vow of silence. That's actually the first records of fingerspelling when they couldn't speak, but sometimes they did need to communicate. So they would fingerspell very quickly what they needed to say. Maybe not entire conversations, but maybe the very useful things. And now I'm skipping very, very fast over to the 18th century. Um, there is a French man called Pierre Desloges who lost his ability to hear when he was 7, so he turned deaf. And he traveled through France and he observed that there was actually well-developed structured language, actually well-developed structured languages all around France. And the main issue was that the deaf people were isolated and did not communicate. So that's why they had created various sign languages. They were mostly ad hoc home signs that were used between the deaf person and their families or loved ones. Um, and there's actually one story that is very well known in the deaf world. This one took place in 1760. According to the legend, it was pouring rain, and an abbot called Charles Michel de l'Épée was seeking shelter, and he pushed open a door and he saw two sisters. They were having a deep conversation in sign language, or actually signing. It wasn't what we call now sign language. So this abbot, also called Father of the Deaf, was really intrigued, and he decided that he wanted to work with them, so educate them, and he became their guardian and educated them. He's often credited for being the inventor of sign language, but that's not really true. What he did do is create the first school for deaf people, and that was in Paris. Another great achievement that Abbott did was that he proved to the world that deaf people were not dumb. Deaf people were able to communicate. Deaf people were sometimes very intelligent. What he did in his school was he taught in something that we call signed French, which is not the same as French Sign Language. Signed French is when you take the French language and for each word you have a sound, a sign. Each word you have a sound, that's just French. For each word you have a sign, and he would speak French, but by signing each word, which means that he taught French grammar to people who signed. If I have time, I'll get back to what the implications of this are. This school was actually a great thing because, well, it allowed deaf people to be useful members of society and communicate, but also there's this one teacher called Ferdinand Berthier who met with another very, very famous French person called Victor Hugo. And together they developed epistolary friendship, and they kept writing to each other, and that helped the cause of the French language and of French Sign Language as well. Now there's another person who went to that school who I would like to mention. His name is Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. He was, I think, Britain, and his life changed when he had to take care of his neighbor's 9-year-old daughter. That was back in 1814. And a year later, he decided to travel across Europe to try to see how other people raised deaf children. And that's when he found out about the school in Paris back in 1815. And he learned French Sign Language. By then, it was no longer signed French. And he is the father of what we call today American Sign Language. Why? Because after seeing this, after loving the fact that people could communicate with just signs, gestures, movements, he moved to the US, to Washington, D.C., actually, where I am from. So that's why it's a bit of an honor to talk about him. And he created in 1817 the American School for the Deaf, the first school that was entirely and exclusively for deaf people in North America. And it is also the one that existed before Gallaudet University. I'll get back to it, but first I would like to mention the worst day of modern history for deaf people, the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf, which took place in 1880 in Milan, which is why it's also called the Milan Conference. Now, this conference was rigged. The idea was to be prescriptivist and force deaf people to oralize. So the invitations were rigged, and to represent the deaf, they took deaf people, yes, but people who had lost the ability to hear, so who had heard at one point, and their expression was just normal, and they pretended that this was the result you could achieve from oralizing. So almost everyone voted to ban sign language and to insist on what they call the pure oral method, which is basically force deaf people to oralize. There are only two delegations that oppose this, Great Britain and the US, which is why in retaliation for this, the US created the National Association of the Deaf, still in 1880. And a few years later, in 1894, the first university for deaf people was founded. It was named Gallaudet University in honor of Thomas Hopkins, who had created another school back in DC. Now, a very interesting fact about Gallaudet University, apart from the fact that the name is in French, even though we're in the US and we speak English here, is that they used to teach in French Sign Language. The language that Gallaudet imported to the US was French Sign Language. And so that's what, I'm not good at math, 2 centuries, over 2.5? Not yet, 2.25? Don't make me do math. That's a lot of time ago. And sign language was banned in France. Sign language was encouraged in the US. Those two languages evolved differently, and now they're very different. Mostly because, well, since French Sign Language was banned in France, it evolved only among deaf people, so it has very little influence from spoken French. Whereas American Sign Language evolved in America with deaf and hearing people together, and the idea was to be able to communicate. And so there's a very strong contact with English, and it's much more pragmatic, and it uses letters much more, and it's to the point. Just on a side note for this, I would like to state that speakers of signers maybe would be a more accurate term. If you can sign French Sign Language, people who sign American Sign Language will understand what you say, but it doesn't work the other way around. Now, I have no idea how much time I have left. So I'll maybe stop for the history lesson and start maybe talking about today, deaf people today, what the deal is. Fortunately, sign language is no longer banned in France. It's been allowed as of 1991, even though back then it was considered just a gestural patois. And it's only in 2005 that it was officially recognized as a language. Not an official language, just officially recognized as a language. So deaf people are still suffering from much discrimination, from being marginalized, from not being included in anything. I would just like to give you a few tips on how to handle deaf people, whether you have them in your day-to-day lives or not. First of all, and it's very important, deaf people are not gynecologists. Do not ask them to read your lips. It is very hard. You cannot understand everything. It is much easier to just mime what you want to say. Even if you feel very stupid, it'll be much easier for them to understand than if you try to force them to read lips. Plus, who tells you that this deaf person learned your spoken language? When I say mime, use facial expressions. They're very useful. You know, lift your eyebrows when you're surprised, or frown when you're trying to say that you're angry or something, or smile, or this is very helpful too. Don't hesitate to point. And well, now that we're in a post-COVID world, there's actually a bigger chance that you will have people who are deaf in your followers, maybe if you create contents. And to this effect, there's only one thing really that I need to tell you. Caption your contents. Both TikTok and Instagram allow this. Otherwise, if you're on YouTube, just like put on the captions, just write the subtitles. It is very useful. It allows them to feel included and not be marginalized. And this is the only way we will be moving into a more inclusive society. And my last point was, yes, the words that you can use and you should avoid using. First of all, being deaf does not mean being handicapped. You will offend deaf people by calling them handicapped. They are to use their term in a situation where there is a handicap that is very long. Just don't refer to deaf people as handicapped because a deaf person can do the same thing a hearing person can. With a few exceptions, you will never see a deaf person, I don't know, working as an opera singer or a sound technician, of course, but they can do anything else that a hearing person can do. And as I mentioned before, do not use the word mute or dumb because they can communicate. And some actually choose not to speak, but have been taught to oralize. And some are actually really good at speaking. So do not use the very old-fashioned expression deaf dumb or deaf mute. Just deaf or hearing impaired for those who can hear a little bit, but still need the extra technology to help them, or still prefer sign language. Um, and on this note, I will thank you for giving me the floor. And if you want to know more about this, I will speak more about deaf people tomorrow at WIPS. Thank you.